Please, buy me and make me your wife, whispered the alien woman, chained like a wild animal. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Streets and drying sweat on the skin before it could cool. Grant Mercer rode in at a steady pace, his posture straight, his eyes half hidden beneath the brim of his hat. The town was loud as usual, wagons rattling, men arguing over cards, a dog barking at every passerby, but Grant moved through it like a man who had no interest in joining any of it. Grant was 37 years old, tall and broad across the shoulders, with a lean build shaped by long days on the ranch. His hair, ash brown and slightly unkempt, curled at his collar. His face carried the tired marks of a man who had worked more years than he had lived, deep-set eyes holding a quiet alertness. His past was not complicated, but it was heavy. A failed marriage that left him wary of closeness. A brother killed in a land dispute years earlier. And a long stretch of wandering afterward, drifting from town to town, taking work where he could until he finally bought a piece of land far enough from crowds to breathe. He came to Red Crossing today for supplies, flour, coffee, a new file for the fence posts, maybe a bottle of whiskey if he felt like remembering anything slowly. His only mission was to get what he needed and leave before nightfall. Grant did not like staying in towns longer than necessary. Too many eyes. Too many people who thought silence meant weakness. He tied his horse outside the general store, stepped down, and dusted his coat. That was when he heard it, the noise behind the saloon. Raised voices, rough laughter, something sharp in the sound that stood out even in a place like this. It made the skin on the back of his neck tighten. Trouble in a town wasn't unusual, but this sounded like something uglier. Grant hesitated. He didn't meddle. Not anymore. But the tone in those voices pushed at something instinctive in him, something that never fully disappeared no matter how far he moved from his past. He walked toward the noise. Behind the saloon, the light dimmed under the shadow of the building, and the smell of spilled liquor and hot wood hung in the air. A small crowd had gathered in a half circle. Men with bottles in hand, a few leaning forward like they were watching a show. Grant pushed through without speaking, his face calm, but his senses alert. Then he saw her. A young Apache woman stood chained to a thick wooden post. Her wrists were pulled above her head by iron cuffs, the metal digging into raw skin. Her dress, deerskin, worn and torn, hung unevenly on her body. The neckline had ripped down one side, exposing a clear line of cleavage streaked with dust and sweat. The dress had also split along the thigh, revealing the curve of her hip and a cut that looked several hours old. Bruises marked her arms. Her long black hair was braided but tangled, with broken feather pieces still caught in the strands. Her feet were bare. The dirt around them was scuffed from struggling. Ayanna. That was her name, though Grant didn't know it yet. She was 24, with the kind of strength that shows even when someone is exhausted. Her eyes were sharp and dark, scanning the crowd, not with defiance, but calculation. She wasn't broken. She was trapped, and she understood what that meant in a town like Red Crossing. Grant felt something shift in his chest, not out of pity, but recognition. The look of a person who had lost their choices. One of the men stepped closer to her, lifting her chin with the tip of his boot. Pretty thing, ain't she? Sheriff said, she ain't worth the sell. Figured we'd sell her off before she dies of nothing. A few men laughed. Another reached as if to touch her, but she jerked away. Grant's jaw tightened. The last thing he wanted was to get involved. He came here for supplies. Nothing more. He had built his life around staying far from other people's problems. Getting attached had never ended well for him. Then her eyes lifted and found his. She stared at him with a focus that cut through the noise around them. Something in her expression changed, fear, hope, desperation mixing in a way that made her chest rise and fall faster. She whispered, soft, shaking, "Please buy me and make me your wife." The words hit him like a jolt, not because of the meaning, but because of the tone. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't a trick. It was survival. She said, "Wife," because that was the only protection this town would respect. Anything else left her open to whatever the men here decided to do. Grant felt his pulse climb, a slow, steady thump under his ribs. He didn't want this. He didn't want another life tied to his. He had just begun to feel steady again after years of wandering. But the look in her eyes made his breath tighten. A person asking not for affection, but safety. A person who knew they were out of time. Grant stepped forward. "What's the price?" His voice came out low and even. One of the men turned, surprised that the quiet rancher had spoken at all. "You want her?" he said, smirking. "She's cheap. Won't last long." Grant didn't react. He waited. The man named a number. Grant reached into his coat, pulled the coins, and handed them over without hesitation. The laughter in the crowd faded. They had expected bargaining or bragging, not a quiet transaction. Grant walked past them without a word, drew the knife from his belt, and cut the leather loop holding the chain in place. The iron slackened. Ayana's legs buckled from the strain, and she fell forward. Grant caught her before she hit the ground, his hands firm around her arms. Her body trembled against him. Her breathing was shallow but steady. For a moment, she gripped his shirt as though she expected him to let go, and wanted to anchor herself before he did. "You can walk," he asked quietly. She nodded, though her voice barely held. "I will try." He took her outside the circle of men, lifting her onto his horse with careful precision. She winced when the movement stretched the bruised skin along her ribs, and Grant adjusted her position until she could breathe without pain. He mounted behind her. His arms slid around her waist to keep her steady. She leaned against him, not out of choice but necessity, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. He could feel the tremor in her muscles and the uneven rhythm of her breathing. Grant clicked the reins and moved the horse toward the open road leading out of town. The crowd watched them leave, but no one followed. The deal had been made. The scene was finished. As Red Crossing faded behind them, Ayana exhaled shakily and closed her eyes. Grant kept his gaze ahead, the weight of her body against him unfamiliar but not unwelcome. He didn't understand why he had stepped in. Not fully, but he knew one thing. He couldn't have walked away. Not this time. Not from her. And as the road stretched out before them, he felt the first pull of a decision that would change both their lives, whether he was ready for it or not. The road out of Red Crossing stretched long and empty, the land turning quieter with every mile Grant put between them and the town. The horse moved at an even pace, dust rising behind its hooves. Grant kept one arm firm around Ayana's waist so she wouldn't slide, and as the heat softened in a late afternoon light, he felt her breathing steadier against his chest, no longer rapid from fear, but still uneven from exhaustion. He hadn't planned for any of this. He hadn't planned for anyone at all. His ranch was built for a single man, one bed, one chair by the fire, one plate on the shelf. He lived far enough in the world that people rarely came to his door, and he liked it that way. Yet here he was with a woman leaning against him, barely strong enough to sit upright, carrying bruises and cuts that would need tending. He understood the first question listeners might have asked after Chapter 1. Why he helped her when he had spent so many years avoiding new attachments. The answer came to him now in a quiet, steady thought he hadn't admitted earlier. He knew what it looked like when someone had no one left. He recognized it in her face because he had carried the same emptiness once. Ayana stirred, shifting slightly as the horse climbed a shallow rise. Her fingers curled around his forearm for balance, and he felt how weak her grip was, how much she was pushing her body to keep from falling. "You need a rest," Grant said, his voice quiet but firm. She looked over her shoulder, her dark eyes shadowed by fatigue. "I can stay awake," she murmured. "You don't have to. Just lean back." He adjusted his arm, giving her more support. She hesitated, uncertain if she should trust the offer. Then a slow breath escaped her, and she allowed her weight to settle fully against him. Her head rested against his shoulder again, her hair brushing the front of his coat. Beneath the dirt and sweat, he could feel the trembling still in her muscles. Another question he knew listeners would have. Who exactly was she running from? And why had she been alone near Red Crossing? Ayana had said nothing about her husband or tribe in the first chapter, and Grant had not asked. He didn't believe in forcing anyone to speak before they were ready. But the silence between them today felt less like a barrier and more like something both of them understood. When the sun dipped lower, Grant stopped near a shaded rise where a thin creek cut through the ground. He dismounted first, then lifted her down carefully. Ayana's legs nearly gave out again, and Grant steadied her by the elbows. "Sit," he said, nodding toward a flat rock near the water. She obeyed, lowering herself slowly. Her hands shook as she brushed dust off her knees. Grant tied the horse, then came back with his canteen. He crouched beside her, watching the way she avoided looking directly at him, unsure of what he expected from her now that the deal in town was over. "Drink," he said, unscrewing the cap. She reached for it, but her hands trembled so hard she almost dropped it. Grant held the canteen to her lips instead. She sipped cautiously, water running down the corner of her mouth. He wiped it away with the edge of his sleeve without thinking. Ayana looked at him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "You didn't ask," she said quietly. "Ask what?" "Who I am. Why they chained me." He capped the canteen, glanced over the creek, then back at her. "You'll tell me if you want to." Ayana lowered her gaze, shoulders tightening. She didn't speak for several seconds. Then her voice came out low, steady, shaped by a mix of fear and defiance. "My tribe is gone," she said. "My husband died in the spring. I left because there was nothing for me there anymore. I traveled toward the border to find work or shelter. Soldiers found me first. They thought I was a scout. They accused me of stealing from a wagon. When I denied it, they beat me. They dragged me into that town." Grant listened without interrupting. Every detail landed heavy in his chest. He didn't press for more. Her breathing grew rough near the end of her explanation, not from emotion, but from the effort of pushing the words through exhaustion. "I'm not a thief," she said finally, "and I didn't want to die chained like that." "You're not going to," Grant said, his voice firmer than before. She studied him for a long moment, as if searching his face for a lie. She found none. Something in her shoulders loosened. As the last light faded, Grant helped her to her feet. She swayed, and he steadied her again. This time her hand lingered on his arm, gripping for balance but also for reassurance. Her dress shifted when she leaned forward, the torn neckline slipping slightly, exposing the soft curve of her chest and the dirt-streaked skin along her collarbone. She saw him notice, but didn't pull away. She seemed too tired to care, too focused on staying upright. When they mounted the horse again, Ayana rested her forehead against his shoulder. The closeness felt natural now, not forced. Her breathing evened with each mile until she drifted into a half-sleep. Grant kept the horse on the trail toward his land, knowing they still had at least an hour to ride. The sky darkened into a deep blue, the first stars coming through. The air cooled around them, carrying the smell of distant sage. He thought about the questions listeners might still ask. What exactly did Grant want from her? Had he bought her out of duty, desire, or something deeper? The truth sat quietly inside him. He didn't want ownership. He didn't want a servant or a bargain. He wanted her safe. He wanted her alive. And he wanted to understand why her voice had pulled him back from the place he had lived for so long, a place where he didn't let himself feel anything for anyone. When they reached the low rise above his ranch, the lantern on his porch flickered in the wind. Ayana stirred, lifting her head slightly. "This is your home?" she whispered. "Yes," Grant said. "It's quiet. No one bothers us here." She exhaled softly, almost in relief. "Then maybe," she said, her voice faint but earnest, "maybe I can breathe again." Grant held her a little closer as he rode down the slope. And for the first time in years, he felt that familiar tightness in his chest ease. Not entirely, but enough for him to realize something had already changed between them. The night waited around the cabin, calm and open, ready to receive the two people riding toward it. Both of them carrying histories they had not yet shared, and both stepping into a future neither had expected when the day began in Red Crossing. The cabin came into view as the horse crossed the final stretch of hard-packed dirt. The lantern on the porch flickered with each small gust, throwing a steady glow across the rough boards. Grant slowed the horse near the steps, feeling Ayana shift weakly in front of him. She had drifted into a deeper sleep during the last mile, her head resting heavily against his chest, her breath warm through his shirt. When he stopped, Her fingers tightened slightly around his forearm, as if her body feared falling even while unconscious. "Ayana," he said quietly, "we're here." Her eyes opened slowly. She blinked at the light, dazed, then pushed herself upright with effort. Grant dismounted first and reached up for her. She slid off the horse in his arms, her legs shaking so badly she clung to him again. "I'm sorry," she whispered, embarrassed at her weakness. "You don't need to be," Grant said. "You've been through hell." He carried her up the steps because she couldn't manage them. It wasn't the intimate act listeners might imagine. It was practical, careful, necessary, but the closeness still sent a quiet pull through both of them. Ayana's breath hitched once as he lifted her, and when he set her down inside the doorway, she steadied herself by holding on to his shirt a moment longer than needed. The cabin interior was warm from the fire Grant had left burning that morning. The single room held a stove, a table, one bed, and shelves lined with tools, dried herbs, and spare clothes. It wasn't much, only what a solitary man needed. But tonight, it would have to be enough for two. Ayana looked around with slow, observant movements, taking in the space as if trying to judge whether it was safe. Grant watched her carefully, aware of another question listeners might ask: why she trusted him so quickly after everything she endured. The answer revealed itself in her cautious but steady gaze. She had no strength left for pride, and Grant had shown her more humanity in 1 hour than the men in Red Crossing had shown her in days. He motioned to the bed. "Sit. I'll get water." She hesitated. "That's your bed. It's the only place you can rest properly," he said. "I'll make a place by the fire." Her eyes lowered, troubled, likely wondering what he expected in return. Grant could see the fear forming behind her tired expression. He stepped closer, his voice steady. "Ayana, you're safe here. I don't want anything from you." Relief hit her hard enough that she sat immediately, her shoulders trembling. Grant felt something tighten in his chest at the sight. Not desire, but anger, a quiet, controlled anger at the men who made her expect the worst from every hand extended to her. He fetched a bowl, filled it with warm water, and returned with a cloth. Ayana watched him approach, unsure. "You're hurt," Grant said. "Let me clean the cuts." She nodded slowly. He crouched beside the bed and began with the scrape on her thigh, holding the cloth carefully so it wouldn't sting too much. Her skin was warm under the dirt, and when he pressed gently, she inhaled sharply but didn't pull away. "You can tell me to stop," he said. "I will tell you if I must," she replied softly. Her voice was steadier now. She was beginning to feel the safety of the room around her. Grant cleaned her arms next, wiping away layers of dust. Ayana's dress slipped at the shoulder, exposing more of her chest, the torn neckline widening slightly. She noticed his glance, but didn't cover herself. She seemed to realize he wasn't looking with hunger. He was looking to see if she was injured. When he finished, she exhaled a long breath, the first real sign of relief he'd seen from her. "Thank you," she said. "You don't need to thank me." She shook her head. "I do. Men don't usually help without wanting something." Grant didn't respond immediately. He moved to the stove, ladling soup from the pot into a cup. The truth was simple. He had wanted nothing when he stepped in. But now he felt something else forming, something he wasn't ready to name. He brought her the cup. She drank slowly, both hands wrapped around it. Her eyes lifted once. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "You could have walked away." Grant's jaw tightened for a moment before he answered. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything. Because I've seen too many people chained down by other men's cruelty. And because you asked." She absorbed that in silence. Then she nodded once, accepting his answer with an understanding that went deeper than words. The fire crackled softly as Grant prepared a place for himself on the floor. He grabbed a spare blanket, spread it near the stove, and set his hat beside him. He didn't look toward the bed again. He didn't want her to feel watched. But Ayana watched him. "You sleep on the floor?" she said. "Tonight I do." "You do not have to." "I do," Grant said simply. She lowered her head, her expression softening, touched by a kind of respect she didn't voice. A minute passed before she whispered, "Grant." He turned slightly. "I feel safe here." He nodded once, his voice quiet. "Good." She lay back against the pillow, her hair spreading across the blanket, her breathing slow and steady. Sleep claimed her quickly. Grant remained seated by the fire, staring into the flames, his thoughts restless. He wondered how long she had been alone before Red Crossing. He wondered if the men who beat her were still nearby. He wondered what bringing her here meant for both of them. And he wondered, quietly, reluctantly, what his life would look like if she chose to stay. Outside, the night grew cold, but inside the cabin the fire kept a steady warmth. Ayanna slept without flinching or crying out, a sign that she finally felt safe enough to rest. Grant watched her for a moment, then lay down and closed his eyes, letting the weight of the day settle into his bones. Two broken lives had collided in the space of an afternoon. The cabin was quiet at dawn, the kind of quiet that settled gently over the room and made every small sound feel clearer. The fire had burned down to soft embers, and the air carried a faint chill that came with early morning. Grant woke before the light reached the windows, as he always did. Old habits never left him. Years of ranch work, years of sleeping lightly, years of expecting trouble even when there was none. He sat up on the floor, stretched his shoulders, and reached for his boots. When he turned his head, he saw Ayanna still asleep on the bed. Her breathing was slow, deep, steady. The tension that had held her body rigid the night before was gone. She lay on her side, hair scattered across the pillow, one arm tucked under her cheek. Her dress had shifted again during the night, the torn neckline sliding enough to show a clean line of her chest and collarbone. But she slept without worry, the way someone sleeps when fear finally releases its hold. Grant watched for only a moment, not out of desire, but out of the strange reassurance he felt seeing her safe. Listeners from earlier chapters would likely wonder whether Ayanna trusted Grant fully or only out of necessity. The answer came now. Her sleep said more than words. She had let herself rest in a stranger's home without waking in panic. That meant something. Grant stood and stepped quietly outside to gather water from the barrel on the porch. The cold morning air hit his face, sharp and waking. He heard birds somewhere in the distance, and the land stretched open around him. The cattle pasture, the low hills, the dry grass shifting in the breeze. This place had always been silent, peaceful, empty. Now it held another life inside it, one that changed the weight of the morning. When he returned, Ayanna was awake, sitting upright on the bed with a blanket pulled around her. She looked alert but cautious, as if unsure of how she should behave in someone else's home. "You slept," Grant said quietly. She nodded. "I did." Her voice was stronger this morning, steadier, though she still looked at him with the uncertainty of someone relearning how to speak around strangers. "I haven't slept like that in too long. You needed it." Ayanna studied him for a moment, as if deciding whether this calm man was truly who he appeared to be. Then she asked a question that listeners might have wondered from the start. "What will you do with me now?" Grant stopped at the table, setting down the tin cup he had filled. "What do you want me to do with you?" She hesitated. Her eyes shifted toward the window before she spoke again. "I don't want to go back to Red Crossing, or anywhere near the soldiers." "You won't," Grant said. She drew in a breath, as if the promise eased something deep inside her. "Then what do you want me to be here? A worker? A wife? Something else?" He understood the fear behind her words. Fear of being traded from one dependence to another. Grant pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "I bought your freedom," he said. "Not you. You're here because you needed to be somewhere safe. You stay as long as you want. If you leave, you leave. If you stay, we figure out together." Ayanna listened carefully. The relief that entered her eyes was slow, hesitant, like something she wasn't used to feeling. She lowered her gaze. "No one has spoken to me like that in a long time." Grant didn't know how to respond to that. He wasn't good with soft words. So he stood and motioned to the stove. "You hungry?" She nodded. He poured what was left of the soup into a tin cup and warmed it. She drank it quietly, watching him from over the rim. She seemed to be studying not what he said, but how he moved, slow, grounded, controlled, as if he carried his thoughts carefully so they wouldn't spill into the room. After she finished, Ayanna pushed the blanket aside and tried to stand. Her legs trembled. Grant stepped forward, but she raised a hand. "I can do it," she said. He stopped, giving her the space she asked for. She stood slowly, gripping the edge of the bed until her balance steadied. She took a few steps toward the door, testing her strength. "I should help," she said suddenly, surprising him. "With what?" "Anything. Work. Chores. I cannot sit and watch you." He shook his head. "You can barely walk. I will get stronger." Her determination wasn't fragile. It was a solid core she held onto even when everything else collapsed. Grant respected that, and he knew listeners might have wondered why Ayanna would want to stay on a ranch owned by a stranger. The answer began forming here. She wasn't trying to be owed or pitted. She wanted purpose. She wanted a place where she wasn't treated as a burden. "You can sweep," Grant said. "If your legs get tired, stop." She nodded once. He gave her the broom. Ayanna moved slowly around the cabin, pushing dust toward the door in small strokes. Each movement looked painful, but she did it without complaint. Grant chopped firewood outside, glancing in occasionally to make sure she hadn't collapsed. By midday, her face was flushed and sweat glistened along her collarbone. The torn neckline of her dress opened slightly as she leaned forward, showing the soft rise of her chest. She didn't seem to notice. Grant did, but not as a man staring at a woman's body, more as someone aware of how vulnerable she still was and how easily the world had taken advantage of that. She paused, leaning on the broom, breathing hard. "That's enough," Grant said, stepping inside. Ayanna straightened but nodded. "I can do more later." "You will rest," he said firmly. She sat on the edge of the bed again, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. Grant brought her a cup of cool water. She drank half, then looked up at him with a seriousness that made him stop. "Grant, what if the soldiers come looking for me?" He'd known the question would come eventually. Listeners would have asked the same. He answered with the truth, plain and calm. "They won't find you here. This ranch sits between hills, and trails lead away from the main roads. No one comes out this far unless they have reason. And if they do," Grant's eyes met hers. "Then they answer to me." Ayanna studied him again, her gaze steady, her breathing slowly easing. For the first time, there was no fear in her eyes, only trust, growing and careful. She reached out, her fingers brushing his hand, a light, unsure touch that carried more weight than words. Grant didn't pull away. The contact lasted only a second, but her hand lingered in the air afterward, as if she wasn't ready to break that moment entirely. Outside, the afternoon sun climbed higher. Inside the cabin, something shifted quietly between them. Nothing loud, nothing sudden, just a slow, steady warmth that filled the space where fear used to sit. By the time Grant returned to his chores, one truth had settled firmly into the day, answering the final unspoken question. Ayanna wasn't planning to leave, and Grant wasn't planning to let her go. The sun dropped lower behind the hills as the long afternoon settled into a warm, steady orange light over the ranch. Grant finished the last of the chopping outside, stacking the wood in precise rows the way he always did. Routine steadied him. Structure kept his thoughts straight. But today his thoughts were anything but simple. Every time he paused to wipe sweat from his brow, his eyes drifted toward the cabin door, checking without meaning to, making sure Ayanna was still there, still safe, still breathing in the shelter of his home. Inside, Ayanna had moved from the bed to the small table, sitting where she could stretch her legs. She carefully folded the blanket Grant had given her, smoothing the edges as if the act itself anchored her. When he finally stepped back inside, she looked up quickly, alert in a way that came from too many months of uncertainty. "You're done?" she asked quietly. "For now," Grant said. She watched him hang his coat, her eyes searching for something she didn't voice. Listeners from the earlier chapters might wonder the same thing. She clearly wondered now. Did Grant regret bringing her here? Was she a burden he hadn't expected? Would he eventually send her away? Grant walked toward the stove and stirred the pot warming there. "You hungry?" "Yes," she said softly, almost apologetically. "But I can wait if you need a rest." "You won't wait," he replied. "You need food." Ayanna hesitated, studying him as if measuring whether she was intruding on a life built without room for others. You act like you're used to taking care of people, she said. The statement caught him off guard. It wasn't judgment, it was observation. I had a brother, Grant said, keeping his tone even, though the memory pressed at him. Younger by 3 years. Needed looking after. What happened to him, she asked. Grant paused, the wooden spoon still in his hand. For a moment, he considered brushing the question aside, but he saw the sincerity in her face, and he realized that she had already shared far more of her past than he had. He got killed, Grant finally said. Land dispute turned bad. I wasn't there when it happened. Ayanna lowered her eyes. I'm sorry. Grant shrugged lightly, but the weight in his voice gave him away. It was a long time ago. But you still carry it, she said gently. Grant didn't answer. He ladled soup into 2 cups and brought them to the table. Ayanna accepted hers with both hands, feeling the warmth against her palms. She took a small sip, then another. Her shoulders relaxed, though the exhaustion still clung to her movements. She glanced at the bed, then at him. You slept there last night. On the floor. I sleep fine anywhere. You shouldn't have, she said. I could have slept closer to the fire. I told you, I wanted you in the bed so you could rest. But you didn't rest. Grant looked at her fully now. That wasn't the point. Ayanna held his gaze, and something softened in her posture, a small, quiet acceptance that he wasn't pretending, that he didn't expect anything from her in return. After they ate, Grant stepped outside to check the fences before dark. Ayanna followed him to the doorway, leaning on the frame, still too weak to walk far. She watched him disappear into the pasture and then return, his walk steady, confident. She studied him the way someone studies a place they are deciding whether to trust. When he came back in, she was still standing there. You don't have to wait at the door for me, he said. She hesitated, unsure how to explain her behavior without sounding foolish. I just wanted to see that you came back. Grant stopped a few steps inside. He didn't smile. He rarely did, but something in his expression shifted, something warmer. I'm not going anywhere, he said. Her breath caught slightly, but she nodded. As the light faded completely, Grant lit a lantern and placed it on the table. The warm glow spread across the room, casting soft shadows. Ayanna's hair glimmered where the light hit it, the loosened braid falling over her shoulder. She paused, then stood slowly, testing her strength. I can help you with something, she said. Tell me what to do. You've done enough today. I need to do more, she insisted quietly. If I don't work, I think too much. Grant understood that better than she realized. For years, he had buried himself in labor to keep from remembering too much. He handed her a piece of torn cloth from his spare sack. Can you mend this? She nodded, grateful. Sitting again, she threaded a needle and began stitching with slow, careful movements. Her hands trembled slightly at first, but her focus steadied them. Grant sat across from her, sharpening a knife. For the first time since she arrived, silence felt comfortable between them. Not heavy, not fearful, shared. After a few minutes, she spoke without looking up. Grant, do you want me to stay here? He set the knife down, the quiet sound breaking the stillness. I didn't bring you here to throw you out, he said. You stay as long as you need. That is not what I'm asking, she said softly. Grant took a slow breath. This was the question listeners would have wondered for chapters now. Did he want her presence, or was he tolerating out of duty? I don't mind you here, Grant said truthfully. It's good to have someone in the cabin again. Ayanna lifted her eyes. And you? Do not fear trouble because of me. I've faced trouble before, Grant said. If more comes, we handle it. We, she repeated. You and me, he said firmly. Ayanna's breath caught in her throat. She looked down at the cloth in her lap, blinking once as if the simple word carried more weight than she expected. Later, when Grant rose to put another log into the stove, she stood with him, moving to his side although her steps were unsteady. The firelight flickered across her face, emphasizing the shape of her cheekbones, the dirt-smeared curve of her neck, the slight opening of her torn dress. Grant looked away politely, but she noticed that too. You treat me like I still belong to myself, she said quietly. You do. Her eyes met his, full of a gratitude she hadn't spoken yet. She reached out, touched his forearm lightly. The gesture was small but intentional, a sign that trust was no longer something forced. It was something chosen. Her fingers lingered. Grant didn't pull away. The room stayed still around them, filled with warmth and quiet promise. And for the first time since their paths crossed in Red Crossing, both of them felt something neither had felt in a long time. A sense that tomorrow might not be as heavy as yesterday, and neither of them would be facing it alone. Night settled fully over the ranch, but the cabin held a steady pool of warmth from the fire and the lantern on the table. Ayanna finished mending the torn cloth and set it aside with a quiet sense of accomplishment. Grant sharpened his last knife and wiped the blade clean. The room felt lived in for the first time in years. Two people working side by side, sharing space without strain. The silence was not empty. It carried a calm that neither of them had expected to find. But as midnight crept closer, another question hung between them. One listeners would surely be asking now. Where would Ayanna sleep tonight? The bed belonged to her the night before because she could barely stand, but now she was stronger, and the decision carried meaning, boundaries, respect, and the careful growth of trust. Ayanna folded her hands in her lap, hesitant. Grant, if you want her bed back tonight, I can sleep by the fire. No, he said immediately. You take the bed. She watched him closely. And you? You cannot sleep on the floor again. I can, he said. It's not new for me. But you shouldn't, she replied, her voice firmer now, less fragile. You gave me safety. I don't want to take more than I should. Grant paused, thinking. He never invited anyone into his private space, never shared his routines, or let people close enough to ask simple questions like where he slept. But she wasn't pushing for closeness. She was trying to respect him. That mattered. You stay in the bed, he said, until you're fully well. She held his gaze. And after that, Grant opened his mouth, then stopped. That was another question listeners would likely have. What was the future between them supposed to be? A temporary shelter? A partnership? Something more? He answered with the only honest truth he had. We'll decide when we get there. Ayanna accepted that. She stood slowly, placing a hand on the table for support. Grant moved forward instinctively, and she held out her palm as if to say she could manage on her own. It impressed him, not her strength, but her determination to reclaim her independence inch by inch. She walked toward the bed, the firelight catching the curve of her collarbone and the soft skin visible through the torn neckline. Her dress shifted as she bent slightly to check the blanket's position. Grant turned away to give her space. Thank you, she said quietly from behind him, for giving me a place to breathe. He nodded once, his voice low. Get some rest. Ayanna lay down again, adjusting the blanket. Grant returned to the stove, banked the fire, and set his bedroll on the floor a few feet away, closer to the wall this time. When he lay down, he could hear the soft rhythm of Ayanna's breathing, steady and calming. Minutes passed before she spoke again. Grant, do you think about your brother often? He exhaled slowly. More than I say. She faced his direction in the dim light. I know how it feels to carry someone who is gone. Grant turned his head slightly toward her. Your husband. Ayanna nodded. He was not a cruel man. He died from fever. The tribe expected me to remarry quickly, but I could not. Her voice tightened. They said my grief made me weak. I slowed the band down. Grant felt something sharp twist in his chest. Is that why you left? They wanted me to belong to someone else immediately, she said, as if I had no say, as if I was only something to pass along. She took a quiet breath. I walked away before they could decide for me. That question answered another lingering curiosity, why she had been alone near Red Crossing. Grant felt the heaviness behind her words, the quiet bravery of someone who chose solitude over ownership. And the soldiers? Grant asked gently. They caught me near the water trail, she said. Accused me of stealing food. I told them I had taken nothing. They didn't care. Grant's jaw tightened. The anger he thought he had buried rose again. You're safe now, he said. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I believe you. The room grew quiet again. Ayanna shifted slightly, turning on her side. The blanket slipped off her shoulder, revealing the soft curve of her upper chest. She didn't notice. Grant did, but he did not move toward her, did not let his eyes linger. He did not want her to misread anything. Respect mattered more than anything else in this moment. "Grant," she said after a long pause, her voice softer, almost tentative, "you say I can stay. But what will my place be here? I do not wish to live without purpose." Grant thought carefully. He knew listeners would want this answer too. "There's enough work on a ranch for 2 people," he said. "You help with what you can. I teach you the rest. And the rest, we figure out together." Ayana considered that, her eyes warm. "That sounds like belonging." "Maybe it is," Grant said. The lantern dimmed as the flame lowered, leaving most of the room in a warm, low glow. Ayana reached out slightly, her fingers just brushing the edge of the bed frame near where Grant lay. The gesture was not deliberate touch, but it was close, close enough that the distance between them felt smaller. "Good night, Grant," she whispered. "Good night, Ayana." As the cabin settled into silence, Grant realized something he hadn't said out loud. He had spent years expecting every tomorrow to look the same: quiet, lonely, predictable. But with her here, even the silence felt different, fuller. And for the first time in years, he didn't dread the morning. He looked forward to it. Morning broke slowly over the hills, spreading a soft gray-blue light across the cabin walls. Grant woke first, the way he always did, but this time he stayed still for a moment before sitting up. The warmth in the room felt different today, calmer, steadier, like the quiet belonged to 2 people instead of 1. He turned his head just enough to see Ayana curled under the blanket, sleeping peacefully on her side, her hair loose around her shoulders. Some of the tension that had marked her face since the moment he found her was finally gone. He watched her for a brief second, not out of longing, but out of a quiet gratitude he didn't know how to name. She was alive. She was here, and she was no longer afraid of him. Grant stood slowly, moving to the stove to restart the fire. Ayana stirred at the sound of the crackling wood, her eyes blinking open in the dim light. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her as the cool air brushed across her bare shoulders. When she saw him, she relaxed immediately. "Good morning," she said softly. "Morning," he replied, pouring water into the kettle. Ayana moved carefully, testing her body. Her legs no longer trembled the way they had yesterday. She stood slowly, steadying herself with a hand on the bedpost, and when she took a few steps toward the table, Grant stepped forward instinctively, though he forced himself to stop halfway so she could find her balance on her own. "You're stronger today," he noted. "I feel more like myself," she said. "It has been a long time since I woke without fear." Her words settled heavily between them, not painful, just honest. Grant set 2 cups on the table. Ayana approached, sitting opposite him, her movements deliberate. The torn neckline of her dress had slipped again during the night, exposing a soft line of her chest. She noticed this time and adjusted the fabric, pulling it higher. Grant looked away out of respect, though the sight stirred something quiet in him that he didn't yet know how to address. She warmed her hands around the cup. "I want to begin working today," she said. "Real work." "Only if you're ready," Grant said. "I am," she replied firmly. "I cannot spend my days as a guest. I need to belong somewhere. And if I am here, I should do my share." Listeners might have asked what Ayana imagined her future role to be: guest, helper, wife, partner. Even Ayana herself wasn't fully certain yet, but she knew she wanted to stand on her own feet again. Grant nodded. "We'll start small. No heavy lifting." Ayana smiled faintly. "You sound like an old man." Grant raised an eyebrow. She covered her mouth, trying not to laugh. The sound, soft, real, eased something in him. After breakfast, they stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, carrying the smell of damp earth from last night's dew. Ayana walked beside him, not behind, her posture straightening with each step. She took in the ranch: fences, grazing land, the water trough, the shed, as if memorizing her new surroundings. "Where do you begin your day?" she asked. "Checking the stock, then the fence lines," Grant replied. She nodded. "Show me." He hesitated. "It's a long walk." "I can do it," she insisted. Grant studied her for a moment. She wasn't pretending to be strong. She wanted to reclaim something she had lost: dignity, independence, the purpose taken from her when she was chained like an animal behind the saloon. "All right," he said. "Stay close." They walked together across the pasture. Ayana's steps were steady but slow. When her leg faltered, Grant placed a hand lightly on her lower back, not holding her up, just guiding her. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into the touch for a brief moment, finding balance there. The horses whinnied when they approached. Ayana paused, her eyes softening as she took in the animal's calm energy. "They are beautiful," she whispered. "They're good stock," Grant said. "Not fancy, just dependable." Dependable is better. Her tone carried meaning, though she didn't explain. Grant felt it anyway. He showed her how to check the water trough, how to inspect the fence rails for breaks, how to listen for signs of an injured animal. She paid attention to everything, absorbing details the way someone does when they're choosing a place to root themselves. After an hour, her energy began to dip. She swayed slightly near the fence, catching herself on the post. Grant stepped to her side. "That's enough," he said. "I can keep going," she insisted. "You shouldn't." She stopped arguing. Her breathing steadied, and she looked up at him, her eyes warm and unguarded. "Thank you for letting me try." Grant nodded. "Let's get inside." They returned to the cabin slowly. Ayana paused on the porch, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She didn't move it. She didn't look away. "Grant," she said softly, "you asked nothing from me, but I want you to know I didn't come here planning to leave." The honesty in her voice sent a slow, steady pulse through him. "I'm not asking you to," he said. She searched his face, and whatever she found made her shoulders relax. Inside, Grant handed her a bowl of water so she could wash the dirt from her hands and neck. As she leaned forward, the dress slipped slightly again, revealing the curve of her chest, the slope of her collarbone, the warm bronze of her skin. This time, she didn't fix it immediately. She let it remain as it was, her eyes lifting toward him as if gauging his reaction. Grant's jaw tightened, a quiet sign of restraint. He didn't stare. He didn't move toward her. But the air between them changed, thicker, closer, charged with something neither had acted on yet. Ayana noticed his restraint and felt a warmth rise in her chest. Respect mixed with the beginning of something deeper. Still kneeling by the table, she asked the question listeners had likely wondered for chapters. "Do you want me here, Grant? Or do you only feel responsible for me?" Grant stepped closer, his voice steady but lower than before. "I want you here." Her breath caught softly, her eyes widening just slightly, not with fear, but with an emotion she had been holding back. Ayana lifted one hand slowly. Her fingertips brushed the back of his hand. Not accidental, not uncertain. Choosing him, not just needing safety. Grant didn't step away. The quiet between them felt different now. No longer empty, no longer cautious. A beginning, steady and real. Outside, the wind moved softly across the hills. Inside, two lives that had collided by chance were now leaning toward each other with intention. The day settled into a stillness that wrapped around the ranch like a thin blanket, not heavy, not tense, just quiet in a way that felt shared instead of lonely. Grant finished checking the shed roof before the afternoon shadows stretched long across the yard. He wiped dust from his hands and glanced toward the cabin, where Ayana sat on the porch step, her braid falling over her shoulder, the torn neckline of her dress resting loosely against the curve of her chest. She was sewing again, mending one of his shirts this time, her fingers moving slowly but with growing strength. When she lifted her head and saw him walking toward her, something shifted in her expression, soft, warm, welcoming. She was no longer wary of him. The fear that once shadowed her eyes was gone. "Is the roof strong?" she asked. "Sturdy enough," Grant replied. "Won't leak this winter." She nodded, satisfied. "Good." Her voice carried a calm he had not heard from her before, and he realized she was finally beginning to believe she had a place here. That was the question so many would have asked in earlier chapters. Did she feel safe, or was she simply surviving? Grant saw the answer in the way she sat, relaxed but attentive, present instead of braced. "Come sit with me," she said. He hesitated, not because he didn't want to, but because sitting beside her felt different now. Intentional. A choice that meant something. But he stepped onto the porch and lowered himself beside her. Their shoulders nearly touched. Ayana set the shirt aside, folding it neatly. "I've been thinking." Grant glanced at her, aware that her thoughts tended to carry weight. About what? About staying here, she said plainly. He swallowed once, steadying his breathing. You already told me you weren't planning to leave. I know, she said, her eyes holding his. But there's a difference between not leaving and choosing a life. Her words hit him quietly but deeply. She wasn't talking about safety anymore. She was talking about belonging. Grant shifted slightly, his voice lower. And what are you choosing? Ayanna looked toward the hills, her face thoughtful. This place gives me room to breathe. It gives me work, purpose. And you give me something that doesn't make sense yet, but I feel it. He didn't interrupt. You don't speak harshly, she continued. You don't demand. You don't touch without reason. I don't feel like something to be taken. Her voice softened further. I feel like someone who matters. Grant let the words sink into the space between them. He didn't know how to respond, not with speech. So he simply said the only thing he knew for certain. You do matter. She exhaled slowly, like that answer loosened something tight inside her. Then she shifted closer, just slightly, her thigh brushing his. It wasn't accidental. Grant felt the warmth of her body through the fabric of his pants, a quiet jolt that traveled through him in a controlled but unmistakable wave. He didn't move away. Grant, she began quietly, almost uncertain. Can I ask something without you thinking I owe you anything? He nodded. Ask whatever you need. She looked down at her hands. If soldiers or men from town came here, would you still stand for me? Even if it brought danger? He understood this was the lingering question from earlier chapters. Why risk himself for a woman he'd just met? Whether he would waver if trouble arrived. Grant turned toward her fully. Yes, I would. You don't fear it? She whispered. I've lived through worse, he said. And I'm not letting anyone take you. Her breath shivered, not from fear but from the strength in his voice. She touched his arm, her fingertips pressing lightly into his sleeve. No one ever stood for me before, she said softly. Not like this. He placed his hand gently over hers, not gripping, just resting there. The contact was simple but deliberate. Ayanna's lips parted slightly, and she didn't look away. You're not alone now, Grant said. Ayanna nodded, her throat tightening slightly. I'm learning what that feels like. Grant rose then, offering her his hand. Come inside. The light's dropping. She took it without hesitation, her fingers warm against his palm. When she stood, she wobbled slightly, still regaining her strength, but Grant steadied her automatically. Their bodies brushed, a brief slide of warmth along their sides, and neither stepped back. They entered the cabin. The fire burned low, casting a golden glow across the walls. Ayanna moved to the table, running her hand across the wood. Grant watched her as he removed his coat, noting how her presence filled the space. Quiet, grounded, not demanding but undeniably alive. The cabin had never felt small, but now it felt full. She turned to him. Can you teach me something? What? Something useful. Something that makes me part of this place. Grant thought, then reached for a small knife from the shelf. She tensed for a moment, not fear, but memory, then took a slow breath. I want to learn, she repeated. He handed her the knife carefully by the handle. First rule, never rush. Slow hands keep you safe. She nodded, eyes focused. He stood behind her, close enough to guide her movements but not touching her unless necessary. His voice was steady low. Grip here. Angle this way. Ayanna moved the knife slowly, her arm brushing his. Each time she shifted, Grant felt the warmth of her back near his chest, the scent of her skin, dust, sweat, something faintly sweet like sage. He kept his breath even, aware of every inch of distance and every inch of closeness. After a few minutes, she set the knife down gently. Thank you. Her voice carried a tone deeper than gratitude. She turned toward him. They stood close, closer than they ever had. Her body rose and fell with steady breaths, her chest barely an inch from his. The torn neckline slid again, revealing the soft rise of her skin. This time she didn't fix it. Her eyes held his. Grant, she whispered, I don't want you to sleep on the floor again. He swallowed. You need the bed. I'm not asking to take something from you, she said. I'm asking because I feel safe when you're near. His heartbeat tightened, slow but heavy. He didn't step forward. He didn't step back. Ayana, he said carefully, you've been through too much. I won't take advantage of that. You're not, she said. I know the difference. The truth in her voice cut through every doubt he had. She lifted a hand and placed it lightly against his chest, over his shirt, over the steady beat beneath. The touch was soft but purposeful. Grant let out a slow breath, his eyes meeting hers fully now. I want you here, she whispered. Next to me, not because I'm afraid, but because I choose it. The fire crackled behind them. Grant placed his hand over hers, steady and warm. If that's what you want, he said quietly, then I'll stay. Her breath trembled, not in fear, but in relief. The distance between them vanished as she stepped closer, resting her forehead lightly against his jaw. Grant's arm slid around her waist, not pulling, just holding, careful but certain. Outside, the wind brushed the cabin walls. Inside, the choice they had been circling for days finally took shape. Not rushed, not forced, not taken. Chosen. Two people who had arrived at each other through hardship, now standing together in a room that felt too small to contain the shift happening between them. And neither of them turned away. The fire burned low, casting a soft and steady glow through the cabin. Ayana stood close to Grant, her hand resting against his chest as if she were memorizing the feel of his heartbeat. He didn't move away. He didn't rush her. He simply stayed there, giving her the space to decide what this moment meant. She lifted her head slowly. Her eyes held no fear now, only certainty. I want this, she whispered. I want you. Not for safety, not for shelter, because you see me, not as something broken. Grant inhaled slowly, the weight of her words settling deep inside him. For years, he had lived behind walls that kept everyone out. Now those walls felt unnecessary, even foolish, with her standing in front of him, choosing him without pressure or expectation. You're not broken, he said quietly. You're strong, stronger than anyone I've ever met. Her lips trembled at the edge of a smile. Then stay with me tonight. He brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, his fingers gentle against her skin. If you're sure, he said. I am, she replied. For the first time in a long time. I'm sure. He guided her to the bed, slow and respectful. Their movements were careful, two people not rushing toward desire, but allowing closeness to unfold in its natural rhythm. She lay back, pulling him down beside her. His body aligned with hers, warm and steady. Their breaths mingled. Their kiss came quietly at first, soft, testing, full of the weight of everything unspoken. Then deeper, shaped by trust rather than hunger. Her fingers slipped behind his neck, pulling him close. His hand traced the curve of her waist, then her hip, the torn fabric of her dress loosening under the motion. Ayana exhaled against his lips, her body arching into his touch, her trust absolute. Hours passed in warmth and closeness, marked not by urgency, but by the slow, grounded connection of two people choosing each other fully. When they finally slept, she curled against his chest, her hand resting where her fear used to live. Morning arrived without the weight of uncertainty. Sunlight broke gently across the bed, warming Ayana's face. She stirred, blinking softly before turning toward Grant. He was already awake, his arm draped over her waist, his gaze steady and calm. Good morning, she murmured. Morning, he replied, brushing his thumb over her cheek. Ayana sat up slowly, letting the blanket fall around her waist. The torn dress clung loosely to her shoulders, exposing the warm bronze of her skin. She didn't hide herself. She didn't shrink back. She belonged here now. Grant slid closer, his hand resting gently at the small of her back. You okay? I'm more than okay, she said. I feel alive again. He smiled, small, rare, but real. They got dressed and stepped onto the porch. The air held a cool breeze, carrying the scent of fresh earth. Ayana looked across the land that now belonged to her as much as it belonged to him. I want to help you fix this place, she said. All of it. Not because I owe you, but because I want this to be my home too. It already is, Grant said. She closed her hand around his, threading her fingers between his. And you? Are you ready to not be alone anymore? He squeezed her hand. I'm ready. As they walked toward the pasture together, the last unanswered questions of their story, whether she would stay, whether he wanted her, what future awaited them, faded away. The choices had been made. The path was clear. Ayanna paused and turned to him. Grant. Yeah. She lifted his hand and pressed it against her heart. I choose you. Not because you saved me. Because you stayed. Grant pulled her into a quiet embrace, his lips brushing her hair. I'm not going anywhere. Their future wasn't built on rescue or fear. It was built on staying, on waking together, on choosing each other in the quiet hours of morning and the long stretch of night. And in the stillness of the ranch, under the rising sun, Grant Mercer and Ayanna, two people who had expected nothing, found a life they would build together one day at a time. A life they would never walk away from.